The wheel snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and Alice Renwick was thrown sideways against the door of the coach as the whole world tipped. Rain came through the broken window in a hard, cold sheet. The horses screamed. The driver shouted something she could not hear over the wind, and then the coach settled into the mud at an angle that made her stomach turn. She pressed a hand to her ribs, gasping, and looked across the tilted seat at the only other passenger inside. He was already moving, already prying at the door above them with a strength that surprised her, given how still and silent he had been for the last 3 hours of the journey. He got the door open, and rain poured in even harder, and he reached down without a word and pulled her up and out into the storm. They stood together on the road, soaked within seconds, watching the driver fight to calm the horses while the coach lay useless in a ditch. Lightning cracked somewhere close, and Alice flinched. The man beside her did not. He simply turned his head, studied the dark line of trees ahead, and said the only sensible thing left to say. "There is an inn half a mile on. We passed the sign before the storm broke." His voice was calm in a way that made her calmer too, though she did not know him, though she had spent the whole journey avoiding his eyes, because a woman traveling alone did not make conversation with strange gentlemen in closed coaches. But there was no time now for the manners that had shaped her whole life. There was only mud, and wind, and the driver shouting that the axle was broken beyond repair, and the man beside her offering his arm as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She took it. She had no choice. The walk to the inn took 20 minutes that felt like 2 hours. By the time they reached the door, both of them were soaked through, and Alice's traveling case, carried by the driver behind them, was heavy with rain. The inn was a low timbered building with a crooked sign and one lit window, and when the man pushed open the door, warmth and the smell of wood smoke rolled out to meet them. The innkeeper, a broad woman named Mrs. Judd, took one look at their state and did not ask questions before pulling them both toward the fire. It was only after they were dripping onto her flagstones and she had called for dry blankets that she delivered the news that changed everything. "There is only one room left," she said. "The storm has filled every bed in the county tonight. Take it or walk back out into that." Alice felt her face go hot despite the cold rain still running down her neck. She opened her mouth to object, to ask for anything else. A corner of the kitchen, a chair by the fire, anything that did not involve sharing a room with a man she had known for exactly one carriage ride. But the man beside her spoke first, and his voice left no room for argument. "We will take the room," he said. "Thank you." Mrs. Judd nodded, and turned to lead them up a narrow staircase, and Alice found herself following, too tired and too cold to fight what could not be changed. It was only when they reached the room itself, a small space under the eaves with a single narrow bed, a washstand, and a fireplace already laid but not lit, that the full weight of the situation settled onto her shoulders. "One bed," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. He said nothing. He crossed to the fireplace and knelt to light it, and Alice watched his hands work with the same quiet competence he had shown at the coach, and she thought, not for the first time that evening, that she still did not know his name. It was Mrs. Judd who supplied it, poking her head back through the door with an armful of dry linen. "Duke, your grace, will there be anything else before I retire? The storm has us all working past our hour tonight." Alice went very still. "Duke." She looked at the man crouched by the fire, at his plain dark coat, unremarkable in every way she had noticed on the road, and understood now why he had not offered his name, why he had ridden 3 hours without speaking more than a dozen words. He had not wanted to be known, and she, a governess without a position, traveling alone to a household that did not yet know her face, had spent an entire storm beside a duke without the smallest idea. He rose from the fire once it caught, dusted off his knees, and turned to face her properly for the first time since they had entered the room. His expression was guarded, almost wary, as if he expected her manner to change now that she knew his rank. Perhaps it had changed already, without her meaning it to. "Frederick Lang," he said simply. "I would have told you sooner, but the road did not seem the place for it, and I confess I have grown tired of the way people speak to a title rather than a man." Alice found her voice at last. "Alice Renwick," she said. "I am a governess, or I will be, once I reach Hollowmere and take up my position. I did not mean to stare." "You did not stare," he said, with the ghost of something that might have been a smile. "You went very quiet, which is a different thing entirely, and a rarer one in my experience." There was a silence then, filled only by the crackle of the new fire, and the storm still battering the small window. Alice looked at the bed, and then at him, and felt the awkwardness of the situation press down on her all over again. It was one thing to share a coach with a stranger. It was another thing entirely to share a room, and only one bed between them, until the storm broke and the road could be traveled again. He seemed to read the direction of her thoughts, because he spoke before she had to find the words herself. "You will take the bed," he said. "I will manage on the floor." "Your Grace, that is not necessary," she began, but he cut her off, not unkindly, but with the same flat certainty he had used to claim the room downstairs. "It is entirely necessary," he said. "I will not have it said, even by no one but myself, that I let a lady sleep on bare boards while I took the only bed in the house. The matter is settled." Alice wanted to argue. Every instinct told her that propriety demanded she refuse, that a duke did not sleep on floors while governesses took beds, that the whole arrangement was upside down in a way that would scandalize anyone who heard of it. But there was something in his face, some tired stubbornness beneath the polished manners, that told her arguing would achieve nothing, except to waste both their strength on a fight neither of them needed tonight. "Thank you," she said instead, quietly. He nodded once, as if the matter required no further discussion, and busied himself pulling one of the thin blankets Mrs. Judd had left toward a spot on the floor near the fire, arranging it with the same brisk efficiency he brought to everything. Alice watched him for a moment longer than she meant to, then turned away to hang her wet cloak near the flames, giving herself something to do with her hands. The storm did not ease. If anything, it grew louder as the night went on, rain hammering the roof, wind finding every gap in the old timbers and turning them into low, mournful sounds. Alice sat on the edge of the bed once she had done all she could with her wet clothes, and found she did not know what to say to the man now settling himself onto the floor with nothing but a blanket and his own coat for warmth. "You should have the second blanket as well," she said, before she could stop herself. "I am quite comfortable," he said, though the floor beneath the thin blanket looked hard and cold even from where she sat. "You are lying," she said, and then immediately wished she had not, because one did not call a duke a liar, not even gently, not even when it was almost certainly true. But he only laughed, low and surprised, as if the sound had escaped him before he could stop it. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it changed his whole face, softened the guarded lines around his eyes. "I am lying," he admitted. "But I will survive the night regardless, and you will sleep better knowing you did not force a guest onto bare boards." Alice pulled the second blanket from the bed anyway and held it out toward him. "Take it," she said. "I insist. And do not tell me it is unnecessary, because we will only argue about it for another quarter hour, and I am too tired for that tonight." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then took the blanket from her outstretched hand. Their fingers brushed briefly in the exchange, and Alice felt the touch more than she expected to. A small, unwelcome awareness that had no place in a room shared out of necessity and nothing else. "Thank you," he said, and this time his voice was quieter, stripped of the polished ease he had used downstairs. Alice climbed into the narrow bed, pulling the remaining blanket up to her chin, and lay listening to the storm, and to the small sounds of him settling on the floor a few feet away. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the sloped ceiling, and for a long while neither of them spoke. "I am not in the habit of announcing my rank," he said eventually, into the dark. "I would ask that you not treat me differently for knowing it. I have had enough of that to last several lifetimes." "I was not planning to curtsy in my nightclothes, if that is what concerns you," Alice said, and heard him laugh again, softer this time. "That is precisely what I was afraid of," he said. Silence returned, but it felt different now, less strained than before. Alice lay awake long after his breathing settled into something slow and steady, staring up at the dark ceiling and listening to the storm rage on outside, wondering how a broken wheel in a stranger's title had managed to turn one ordinary journey into something she suspected she would remember for a very long time. The candle guttered out sometime past midnight, and still she did not sleep, aware in a way she could not explain of the man lying only a few feet from her, close enough to speak to in a whisper, and yet a world away in everything that mattered. She thought of her plain traveling case, of the position waiting for her at Hollowmere, of a life mapped out in small, careful steps that left no room for storms or dukes or nights like this one. Outside, the wind screamed against the shutters, and somewhere in the dark, Frederick Lang shifted on the hard floor, and Alice Renwick finally closed her eyes, unable to guess that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one already beginning inside the small room under the eaves. Alice woke to the sound of rain still falling, though softer now, a steady patter instead of the violent hammering of the night before. For a moment she did not remember where she was, and then her eyes found the low ceiling, the cold gray light at the small window, and the shape of a man asleep on the floor with his coat pulled over him like a second blanket. and everything came rushing back. She lay still for a moment, watching him without meaning to. Asleep, the guarded look was gone from his face, and he seemed younger, less like a duke and more like an ordinary man exhausted by a long night on hard boards. She felt a small twist of guilt at the sight, though she reminded herself firmly that the arrangement had been his choice, made before she could refuse it. He woke a few minutes later, blinking up at the ceiling before pushing himself upright with a wince he tried and failed to hide. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "I trust you slept better than I did." "I slept adequately," Alice said, sitting up and pulling the blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. "You look as though you did not sleep at all." "The floor and I did not come to a full agreement," he admitted, rubbing at his shoulder. "But I will live. Is the storm still raging, or have I simply grown accustomed to the sound of it?" Alice crossed to the small window and looked out at a world gone gray and drowned. The road below the inn had become a wide brown stream, and the trees beyond bent low under a wind that showed no sign of easing. "It is worse, if anything," she said. "I do not think we will be traveling today." Frederick joined her at the window, standing close enough that she was aware of him in a way she had not quite managed to shake since the night before. He studied the flooded road with a frown, and Alice studied him instead, noting the sharp line of his jaw, the tired set of his shoulders, the way his easy manner from the night before had settled back into something more careful now that daylight had returned, and reminded them both of who they were supposed to be. "Mrs. Judd will have breakfast ready," he said eventually, stepping back from the window. "I will go down and arrange for some, if you would rather not be seen in your traveling clothes from yesterday." It was a small kindness, offered without ceremony, and Alice found herself grateful for it in a way that surprised her. "Thank you," she said. "I would rather not, if it can be helped." He left her alone to dress, and Alice took the moment to examine her side where she had struck it against the coach door the night before. A bruise had bloomed dark along her ribs, tender when she pressed it, though nothing seemed broken. She dressed quickly, wincing more than once, and had just finished when a knock came at the door and Frederick's voice asked if she was decent. She was, and he entered carrying a tray with bread, cheese, and 2 cups of something hot that turned out to be a thin but welcome tea. They ate at the small table by the window, the silence between them less awkward than it had been the night before, filled instead with the small business of breakfast and the steady drumming of rain on the roof. "You are favoring your side," Frederick said, after watching her shift in her chair for the 3rd time. "Are you injured?" "It is nothing," Alice said quickly. "A bruise from the coach, that is all." "Let me see it," he said, and then seemed to hear himself, because color rose faintly in his face. "That is to say, describe it to me. I have some knowledge of injuries, more than most gentlemen have cause to, and I would rather know if you require a physician than have you suffer in silence out of pride." Alice hesitated, then relented, describing the size and tenderness of the bruise while he listened with a focus that felt strange to be on the receiving end of, from a man of his rank, over something so small as her comfort. When she finished, he nodded, satisfied. "It sounds like nothing worse than a bruise," he said. "But you should rest today regardless, and not strain yourself. I imagine we are both owed a quiet day, given the night we have had." "I do not think either of us has much choice, given the road," Alice said, glancing again toward the flooded window. "No," he agreed. "We do not." The day passed slowly. Mrs. Judd kept the fire well fed and brought them simple meals throughout the day, and between those small interruptions, Alice and Frederick found themselves talking in a way that felt entirely unlike the silence of the coach ride the day before. He asked about her position at Hollowmere, and she found herself telling him more than she meant to, about the family she had lost young, about the years of careful work that had brought her to this single opportunity, about how much rested on her arrival there being smooth and uneventful, which this delay was already threatening to undo. "You speak of it as though failure would end you," he said at one point, watching her with an intensity that made her look away. "It very nearly would," she admitted. "I have no family left to fall back on, Your Grace. This position is not a preference, it is a necessity." He was quiet for a long moment after that, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "I understand more of that than you might expect," he said finally. "Necessity has shaped more of my life than anyone imagines," looking at the title. Alice looked up at that, curious despite herself. "I would have thought a duke has very little that could be called necessity," she said. "Most men would trade places with you without a second thought." "Most men do not know what they would be trading for," he said, and something in his voice had gone flat and tired, in a way she had not heard from him before. "I am traveling under my own name to no one, and under no name at all to the world, because I am running from an arrangement I never agreed to and cannot seem to escape. My uncle has spent the better part of 2 years arranging a marriage on my behalf, to a woman I have met perhaps 3 times, because it suits the family and the estate and everyone's interests except my own. Alice sat with that for a moment, surprised by the sudden honesty of it, by how easily it had come from a man who had refused to give his name only the night before. "And you are traveling away from it," she said slowly, "not toward it. Away from it. For as long as I am able," he confirmed. "Though I suspect the road only postpones the conversation, it does not end it." She found she did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, only watched him for a moment as he stared into the fire with an expression she recognized, because she had worn it herself many times in the last several years. It was the look of someone carrying a weight they had long since stopped expecting anyone else to notice. "I am sorry," she said finally. "That sounds like a great deal to carry alone." He looked up at that, something shifting in his face, surprise perhaps, or something gentler than surprise. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Most people, on hearing that story, tell me how fortunate I am to have such problems. You are the first in some time to simply say you are sorry." Alice felt something warm move through her chest at that, an unfamiliar tenderness, toward a man she had known for barely a day, and she pushed it down as firmly as she could, reminding herself that whatever passed between them in this small room, shaped by storm and circumstance, would end the moment the road cleared, and they returned to lives that had no place for each other in them. The afternoon wore on. At one point, helping her rise from her chair after a long stretch of sitting had stiffened her bruised side. Frederick's hand found hers, and neither of them let go quite as quickly as the moment required. Alice noticed it, and from the way his eyes flicked to their joined hands and then away again, she suspected he had noticed it too. By evening the rain had softened further, though it had not stopped, and Mrs. Judd confirmed over their last meal of the day that the road would likely remain impassable until at least the following afternoon, once the water had time to recede. Alice took the news with more calm than she expected to feel, and told herself it was only relief at not having to travel while her side still ached, and not anything to do with the man across the table who had spent the whole day making her forget, for hours at a time, how frightened she truly was about the future waiting for her at Hollowmere. That night, as the fire burned low and Frederick settled once more onto the floor despite her renewed protests, Alice lay awake in the narrow bed and found her thoughts circling back again and again to the story he had told her, about a marriage he did not want and a family closing in around him with every mile he traveled. She thought of her own future, uncertain and precarious, and understood, in a way she had not quite let herself understand the night before, that they were both running from something, in their own ways, and that the storm outside had only made it possible to stop running for a little while and simply be honest, with each other and perhaps with themselves. "Frederick," she said softly into the dark, unsure if he was still awake. "Yes," he answered, his voice close and quiet. "Thank you for telling me," she said, "about the betrothal. I know that could not have been easy to say aloud." There was a pause, long enough that she thought perhaps he had already drifted toward sleep, before his voice came again, quieter still. "It was easier than I expected," he said. "I think that troubles me more than the telling itself." Alice did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the two of them lay in the dark, separated by only a few feet of cold floor, each turning over words neither of them was ready to speak aloud, while the storm outside slowly, gradually, began to ease. A crash of thunder split the sky so close overhead that Alice sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering, before she remembered where she was and why. The storm had returned in the night, with a fury that made the previous evening seem gentle by comparison, and lightning lit the small window in sharp white flashes that threw the whole room into stark relief for half a second at a time. Frederick was already awake, sitting up on the floor with his back against the wall, watching the window with the same wary attention he gave everything. "Are you well?" he asked, when he noticed her sitting upright. "I am," she said, though her voice shook slightly. "I did not expect it to return so violently." "Nor did I," he admitted. "Mrs. Judd said this happens sometimes, when the first storm is only the edge of a larger one moving through. She warned us at supper, though I confess I did not fully understand what she meant until now." Another crack of thunder rolled through the small room, and Alice flinched, despite herself, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She had never cared for storms, not since she was a child, though she had never told anyone the reason why, because the reason was tied up with the loss of her parents in a way that still felt too raw to speak of even now, years later. "You are frightened," Frederick said, not as a question but as an observation. watching her closely in the dim firelight. "I do not care for storms," she admitted, choosing the safer, smaller truth over the larger one. "It is a foolish thing for a grown woman to confess." "It is not foolish," he said, and there was no mockery in his voice, only a quiet steadiness that she found she wanted to lean into. Would it help to talk, rather than lie in the dark listening to it? She considered the offer, and found, to her own surprise, that she wanted to accept it. "Perhaps," she said, "if you do not mind." He rose from the floor and, after a moment's hesitation that she noticed but did not comment on, came to sit on the edge of the bed rather than return to his blanket on the boards, close enough that she could see his face clearly in the firelight, but not so close as to cross any line that mattered. It felt in that moment like the most natural thing in the world, though she knew it was not. Knew that a duke did not sit on the edge of a governess's bed in the middle of the night under any circumstance that propriety would recognize. "Tell me why storms frighten you," he said gently, "if you are able." Alice looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of the blanket between her fingers. "My parents died in a storm," she said finally. "Not from lightning. Nothing so dramatic as that. Their carriage went off a flooded road when I was 12, much as ours nearly did 2 nights ago. I was not with them. I was at home, waiting for them to return from visiting my aunt, and I remember hearing the storm outside and thinking how frightened they must be, not knowing yet that they were already gone." Frederick was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had gone soft in a way she had not heard from him before. "I am sorry," he said. "That is a heavy thing to carry from the age of 12. It shaped everything after," she said. "My aunt took me in, but she had little money and less patience for a grieving child, and by 16 I was already being trained for governess work, because it was the only path that did not depend on someone else's charity forever. I have been careful and practical ever since, because I learned early that storms take everything from you without warning, and the only defense is to never depend on anything you cannot control yourself. That is why Hollowmere matters so much to you," he said, understanding dawning in his voice. "It is not simply a position, it is the last piece of control you have left." Alice looked up at him, startled that he had understood so quickly what had taken her years to fully articulate even to herself. "Yes," she said quietly, "exactly that." He was silent for a while after that, and Alice found herself studying his face in the firelight, the careful stillness of it, the way he seemed to be working toward something he was not yet ready to say. When he finally spoke, his voice had a rawness to it that surprised her. "My father died 2 years ago," he said. "Suddenly, of a failure of the heart, with no warning at all. One day he was overseeing the estate as he had for 30 years, and the next I was a duke, with no preparation and no desire for the role, expected to step into a life I had spent my whole youth avoiding, because my father and I disagreed about nearly everything I might have chosen for myself." "I am sorry," Alice said, echoing his own words back to him. "There is a particular kind of guilt," he went on, staring into the fire rather than at her, "in inheriting everything a man builds his whole life, when you spent that same life wishing he would simply let you choose your own path instead of his. I loved my father, I did, but I also resented him, for years, for the weight he placed on me before I was ready to carry it, and when he died, the resentment did not disappear. It simply had nowhere left to go, because the man I was angry at was gone, and all that remained was the title and the expectations, and no one left to argue with about any of it." Alice reached out, almost without deciding to, and rested her hand over his where it lay on the blanket between them. He looked down at the contact, then up at her face, and something passed between them in that look that neither of them named aloud. "That is not a small thing to carry either," she said softly. "Grief and guilt together are heavier than either alone." "I have never said that aloud to anyone," he admitted. "Not to my uncle, not to the woman I am meant to marry, not to a single soul in 2 years. I do not know why it is easier to say to you, in a room I did not choose, during a storm neither of us wanted." "Perhaps because neither of us has anything to lose here," Alice said. "In a few days this room will be behind us, and we will return to lives that have nothing to do with each other. It is easier to be honest with someone you will not have to face again tomorrow in front of everyone who expects you to be someone else." He looked at her for a long moment after she said that, and something in his expression shifted, grew more intent, more focused entirely on her, in a way that made her breath catch slightly. "I am not certain I want that to be true," he said quietly, "that we will have nothing to do with each other, once this room is behind us." Alice's heart beat faster, and she was suddenly, acutely aware of how close he sat, of the warmth of his hand still beneath hers, of the storm raging outside a window that suddenly felt very far away compared to the small distance still remaining between them on the narrow bed. "Frederick," she started, though she did not know what she meant to say after his name, whether it was caution or invitation, and in the end she did not have to decide, because he leaned forward, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and she did not pull away, and for one long moment, his forehead rested against hers, both of them breathing unevenly in the firelight, neither quite closing the last small distance between them. Then he pulled back, abruptly, and rose from the bed as though the contact had cost him something to end. "I should not have done that," he said, his voice rough. "Forgive me. You are under my protection tonight, in every sense that matters, and I have no right to make you uncertain of that." "You did nothing wrong," Alice said, though her own voice was not entirely steady either. "I did not pull away." "That is precisely the trouble," he said, moving back toward his place on the floor, with the same restless energy she had noticed in him from the very first moment at the wrecked coach. "If I stay closer, I am not certain I will have the discipline to stop again, and you deserve better than a man who cannot govern himself around a woman circumstance has placed in his path." Alice watched him settle back onto the hard boards, pulling his blanket around himself with more force than necessary, and felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment that she did not fully understand. "Perhaps discipline is overrated," she said quietly, before she could stop herself. He went very still at that, and for a moment she thought he might rise again, might close the distance he had just so carefully rebuilt between them. But he only laughed, low and a little unsteady, and shook his head against the pillow he had made of his folded coat. "You will be the end of my good sense, Miss Renwick," he said. "I am fairly certain of that already, and we have known each other only 2 days." The storm continued to rage outside, but somehow it felt less frightening to Alice now, softened by the conversation that had passed between them, by the honesty neither of them had expected to offer or receive. She lay back against her pillow, watching the ceiling, aware of him only a few feet away, awake as she was, both of them turning over the moment that had nearly happened and had not, and wondering, in the quiet dark, what exactly they were meant to do with everything the storm had already stripped bare between them. "Frederick," she said again, much later, when she thought he might finally be drifting toward sleep. "Yes," he murmured. "I am glad the wheel broke," she said softly. There was a long pause, and then his voice came back through the dark, warmer than she had heard it yet. "So am I," he said. "God help us both, but so am I." A horse arrived at the inn just after dawn, its rider soaked and mud-spattered, and the sound of raised voices below stairs pulled Alice from a sleep she had only just managed to find. She dressed quickly, her heart already tightening with a nameless dread, and found Frederick standing at the small window, fully dressed, his shoulders rigid in a way she had not seen since the first night in the room. "What has happened?" she asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer would not be good. "A messenger," he said, not turning from the window. "From my uncle. He found me through the coaching inns along this road, which means he has been searching in earnest, which he only does when he believes the matter urgent." Alice crossed to stand beside him, close enough to see the tension in his jaw. "What does he want?" she asked. Frederick was quiet for a moment before answering. "My uncle has moved the wedding forward," he said finally. 3 weeks from now, rather than 3 months. He says the arrangement has waited long enough and that my absence these past days has only confirmed to him that I require a firmer hand in the matter, not a lighter one." Alice felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she told herself firmly that she had no right to feel anything at all about a marriage that had never been any business of hers. "I am sorry," she said, because it seemed the only thing there was to say. He turned to look at her then, and his expression was harder than she had seen it, though she suspected the hardness was not directed at her. "I have to go," he said. "Not to the wedding. Not yet, but my uncle has sent a coach to collect me from the next town, and I cannot avoid him forever. There are people relying on this arrangement, tenants and interests bound up in the estate, and I have run from it as long as I reasonably can." "Of course," Alice said, and was surprised by how steady her voice sounded, given how unsteady she felt beneath it. "You must go where your responsibilities call you." Something flickered across his face at her words, and for a moment she thought he might say something else, might argue that responsibility was not the only thing calling to him. But before he could speak, a second knock came at the door, and Mrs. Judd's voice announced that a letter had also arrived for Miss Renwick, carried by the same messenger who had come with the Duke's news. Alice took the letter with hands that had gone unaccountably cold, and broke the seal to find a short, formal note from Lady Orsdon, the mistress of Hollowmere, informing her that given the delay in her arrival, The household had been forced to secure another governess for the children, and that Miss Renwick's services would no longer be required. She read the letter twice, as though a third reading might change its contents, and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Frederick, watching her face, crossed the room quickly. "What is it?" he asked. "I have lost the position," Alice said, and heard the flatness in her own voice, the particular calm that came from shock too large to feel all at once. "Hollowmere has hired another governess in my absence. I have nothing to travel toward now. No position, and very little money left after the fare for this journey." Frederick took the letter from her unresisting hand and read it himself, his frown deepening with every line. "This is not right," he said. "You were delayed by a storm, by no fault of your own. Any reasonable household would understand that." "Reasonable households do not wait for governesses who might never arrive," Alice said, folding her hands together to stop them from shaking. "They find someone reliable and move on. I cannot blame them for it. I would have done the same, in their position." She sat down heavily in the chair by the window, and Frederick remained standing, watching her with an expression she could not fully read, something between anger and helplessness that did not seem directed at her at all. "I will write to my uncle," he said suddenly. "I will secure you another position, somewhere better than Hollowmere ever was. It is the least I can do, given the circumstance." "No," Alice said, sharper than she intended, and saw him startle slightly at the force of it. "I do not want your charity, Frederick. I have spent my whole life clawing toward independence, and I will not become a favor owed to a duke who feels guilty over a storm neither of us caused." "That is not what I meant," he said, his own voice rising now. "I only meant to help." "I know what you meant," she said, softer now but no less firm. "But you are leaving in a matter of hours to attend to a wedding you have spent 2 days telling me you dread, and I will be left here with no position and no prospects, and the kindest thing you can do is not make promises about futures you may have no power to keep, once you return to the life waiting for you outside this room." Frederick's jaw tightened, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the space between them suddenly wider than it had been at any point since the storm first trapped them together. "Alice," he said finally, quieter now, "you believe I will forget you, once I return to that life." "I believe circumstances will make it very difficult not to," she said, and hated how much it hurt to say it aloud, hated that some part of her had let herself hope for something more, in 2 short days, than any sensible woman ought to hope for from a duke bound for another woman's altar. He crossed the small room and knelt in front of her chair, taking both her hands in his despite the coldness she had tried to put into her voice a moment before. "I have spent 2 years dreading this wedding," he said, low and urgent. "I have spent 2 days in this room with you and felt more like myself than I have in all that time combined. I do not know what that means exactly, or what I am able to do about it, given everything waiting outside this door. But I will not pretend it means nothing, and I will not let you walk away believing I could simply forget 2 days that have already changed how I see the whole rest of my life." Alice's throat tightened, and she looked away from him, toward the window and the gray, softening rain beyond it. "Then what do you propose?" she asked quietly. "That you go and marry Miss Voss as arranged, and think of me fondly from time to time, while I find some new household willing to take a governess with no letters of reference from her last position. I do not know yet," he admitted, and the honesty of it was somehow worse than a lie would have been. "But I know I am not ready to let this be the end of it. Not yet. Please, give me time to think. Before either of us decides what we are to each other once this room is behind us." Below stairs, the messenger's voice rose again, impatient, calling that the coach was waiting, and the roads would not stay passable forever. Frederick closed his eyes briefly at the sound, then rose, still holding one of Alice's hands as though reluctant to let it go entirely. "I have to go down," he said, "but I am not leaving today. I will tell him I need 1 more day, to be certain the road is safe, and it will not be entirely a lie, given how the water still stands on it." Alice said nothing, watching him move toward the door, torn between the wish that he would simply go and end the uncertainty, and the deeper, more frightening wish that he would stay long enough to finish whatever had begun to grow between them in this small room. At the door he paused, looking back at her with an expression that carried more weight than any words he had spoken yet. "Alice," he said, "whatever else happens, thank you for the last 2 days. I do not think I have ever felt so entirely myself with another person, and I will not forget it. Whatever my uncle believes he has already decided for me." Then he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the narrow stairs, and Alice sat alone in the small room, the letter from Lady Orsdon still crumpled in her lap, listening to the raised voices below, and wondering how 2 days could have left her with so much less certainty about her future, and so much more uncertainty about her heart than she had carried into this room in the first place. The room felt smaller that evening, though nothing in it had changed except the silence that had settled between them since Frederick returned from sending the messenger away with word that he required one more day before the coach could depart. He had told his uncle's man that the roads remained unsafe, which was true enough, though both Alice and Frederick knew it was not the whole reason he had chosen to stay. They ate supper with little conversation, both of them careful and polite in a way that felt worse somehow than the argument that morning had nearly become. Alice kept her eyes on her plate more than was strictly necessary, and Frederick, when she did glance up, was watching her with a look that seemed to carry the weight of everything neither of them had yet found the courage to say plainly. Mrs. Judd cleared the dishes eventually, casting a curious glance between the two of them that suggested she had noticed the strain in the room, and left them alone with the fire burning low, and the rain outside finally softening to little more than a whisper against the window. Alice sat by the flames, her hands folded in her lap, aware of Frederick standing near the door, seemingly unable to settle into stillness the way he had on previous nights. "I have spent the whole afternoon thinking," he said eventually, breaking the silence that had stretched too long between them. "And?" Alice asked, not looking up. "And I find I keep arriving at the same conclusion, no matter how many times I try to talk myself out of it," he said. "I do not want to marry Georgiana Voss. I never have. It was arranged when I was little more than a boy, by my father and her father together, for reasons that had everything to do with land and alliance, and nothing at all to do with either of our wishes. I have spent 2 years telling myself that duty requires me to honor it regardless, because that is what a man of my position does. But I do not think duty requires a man to spend his entire life bound to a choice he never made, simply because changing course would be difficult." Alice looked up at him now, her heart beating fast despite herself. "What are you saying, Frederick?" "I am saying that these 2 days in this room have shown me more clearly than 2 years of dread ever managed to, that I want a life built on something more than obligation," he said, crossing the room to kneel again in front of her chair, much as he had that morning, though his expression now held none of the morning's uncertainty. "I want a life where I am permitted to be simply a man, not a title first and a person second. I have felt that, with you, in a way I did not know was possible until this storm forced us into the same small room." Alice's breath caught, and she found she could not quite trust herself to speak, so she said nothing, only watched him, waiting for whatever came next. "I do not know exactly what that means for either of us," he went on, his voice steady despite the raw honesty beneath it. "I know it will not be simple. There will be my uncle, and the estate, and the whole weight of everyone who expects this marriage to proceed as planned. There may be a scandal, and difficulties I cannot fully predict from inside this room, but I know that I would rather face all of it, with the possibility of a life that feels honest, than spend the rest of my years comfortable and hollow beside a woman I do not love, simply because it was arranged for me before I was old enough to object." "Frederick," Alice said finally, her voice trembling slightly, "you barely know me. 2 days is not a foundation for the kind of decision you are describing. 2 days in which I have told you things I have never told another living soul," he said. 2 days in which you have seen me stripped of every title and comfort I usually hide behind, and did not run from what remained. I have spent years surrounded by people who know my rank far better than they know me. I would rather build something slowly with a woman who has seen the man beneath the rank than spend a lifetime with one who never will." Alice looked down at her hands, thinking of everything waiting outside this room, the position she had lost, the uncertain future stretching ahead of her with no clear path forward. "It frightens me," she admitted quietly. "Not you. What might come after. I have spent my whole life building careful small certainties, because I learned young that anything larger could be taken away without warning. What you are describing has no certainty in it at all." "I cannot promise you certainty," he said. "I wish I could. But I can promise that I will not let you face whatever comes next alone, if you are willing to let me stand beside you through it, rather than disappear back into a life that has no place for you in it." Alice reached out, finally, and let her hand rest against his cheek, feeling the roughness of 2 days without a proper shave, the warmth of his skin beneath her palm. He turned his face slightly into the touch, closing his eyes for a brief moment, and when he opened them again, whatever remained of his careful restraint from the night before had gone entirely. "I am afraid," she admitted again, softer now. "But I do not want you to leave either. I have never felt as seen by anyone as I have felt by you these 2 days, and I do not think I am willing to pretend that away simply because it is inconvenient or uncertain." He rose slowly, drawing her up from the chair with him, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the firelight, close enough now that neither of them retreated from the nearness the way they had the night before. This time, when he leaned toward her, she met him halfway, and the kiss that followed was slow and searching, carrying all the honesty of the last 2 days folded into it, nothing rushed, nothing taken that was not freely given in return. When they finally parted, Alice rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and felt something settle inside her that had been unsettled since the moment the wheel first broke on the flooded road. "I still think this is entirely reckless," she murmured, and felt him laugh softly against the top of her head. "Entirely," he agreed. "But I find I have grown tired of being sensible, if sensible only ever leads to a life I do not want." That night, when Frederick moved to take his usual place on the floor, Alice caught his hand before he could settle onto the hard boards, and shook her head. "Enough of the floor," she said quietly. "There is room enough in that bed for both of us to sleep, and nothing more than sleep, if you can manage the discipline you were so worried about losing last night." He looked at her for a long moment, searching her face as though to be certain she meant it, and then nodded, something like wonder in his expression as he settled onto the narrow bed beside her, careful to leave a respectful distance between them, even as the closeness of the space made such distance almost impossible to maintain. Alice pulled the blanket over them both and lay listening to his breathing slow beside her, the last of the storm fading outside the window, and thought that whatever difficulties waited for them beyond this room, she would rather face them having chosen him, than return to the safe, careful, lonely life she had built for herself before a broken wheel changed everything. "Good night, Frederick," she whispered into the dark. "Good night, Alice," he answered, his voice already heavy with sleep, one hand finding hers beneath the blanket and holding it loosely, as though even in sleep he did not want to let her go. Outside, the last of the storm finally passed, leaving behind a stillness that neither of them had felt in the small room since the moment they first arrived, soaked and strangers, into a night that had turned out to hold far more than either of them had ever expected. Morning arrived clear and bright, sunlight pouring through the small window for the first time since the storm had begun, and Alice woke to find Frederick already watching her, his expression open in a way she had not seen from him before this room, before this storm, before everything that had changed between them in a matter of days. "The road will be passable today," he said quietly. "Mrs. Judd confirmed it before dawn." Alice sat up slowly, feeling the strange weight of the moment settle over her. "Then we must decide what happens next," she said. "We already decided," he said, sitting up beside her. "Now we simply have to face the people who will not like the decision." They dressed and packed what little they carried, and over a final breakfast in the small room, Frederick laid out his plan with a steadiness Alice found herself grateful for, given how unsteady her own thoughts still felt. He would travel first to his uncle's estate, not to submit to the wedding as arranged, but to end the betrothal formally and honestly, in person, rather than through a letter that could be dismissed as the product of a passing whim. Alice would travel with him as far as the nearest town with a respectable inn, where she would wait while he settled matters, and where he would return for her once the worst of the confrontation had passed. "I do not like the idea of waiting while you face them alone," Alice said, as they climbed into the repaired coach Mrs. Judd's husband had arranged for them. "It will go worse, not better, if I arrive with you at my side before the betrothal is formally ended," Frederick said gently. "I do not intend to hide you, Alice. But I intend to do this properly, so that when I do bring you forward, no one can say I acted rashly or without honor toward Georgiana, who deserves better than to learn of this in the worst possible way." Alice understood the sense in it, even as the waiting ahead of her filled her with a nervous dread she could not quite shake. The journey passed in a blur of familiar countryside, and by early afternoon they reached the town of Ashwell, where Frederick secured her a room at a respectable inn and pressed a purse into her hands over her initial objections, insisting it was not charity but simply practical sense, given that she had lost her position through no fault of her own, and would need means to sustain herself regardless of what happened next between them. "I will return within 3 days," he said, standing in the doorway of her room, reluctant to leave despite the urgency of what awaited him. "If I am delayed longer than that, you must not assume the worst. These things take time to unravel properly." 3 days, she repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. "I will be here." He kissed her once, gently, and then he was gone, and Alice was left alone in a strange room in a strange town, with nothing to do but wait and hope that the man who had shared a storm with her would return as the man he had promised to be, rather than disappearing back into the life that had nearly claimed him before. The 3 days passed slowly. Alice used the time to write letters, seeking new positions with the careful, practical determination that had carried her through every difficulty in her life before this one, though her heart was not fully in the search, caught as it was on the uncertain outcome of Frederick's confrontation with his family. She thought often of Georgiana Voss, a woman she had never met, and likely never would, and felt a complicated mixture of guilt and sympathy for a stranger, whose own arranged future was being upended by feelings that had grown between two people trapped by a storm. On the third day, as the light began to fade, a coach arrived at the inn, and Alice's heart leapt into her throat as she recognized Frederick descending from it, his face drawn and tired, but carrying an unmistakable relief beneath the exhaustion. "It is done," he said, before she could even ask, crossing the inn's small common room to take both her hands in his. "The betrothal is formally ended. Georgiana, I am glad to say, took the news with more grace than I feared, and confessed she had her own reservations about the match, though neither of us had ever found the courage to voice them until now. Her family is displeased, and mine more so, but the matter is settled, and no one can undo it now." "And your uncle?" Alice asked, searching his face for the toll the confrontation had clearly taken. "My uncle is furious," Frederick admitted. "He has spent 2 years building this alliance and does not take kindly to seeing it dismantled in an afternoon. He said a great many things about duty and family and the foolishness of throwing away a sensible arrangement for a woman met by chance on a flooded road. I told him that the sensible arrangement had never once made me feel the way 2 days in that room made me feel, and that I would rather build a life on honesty than continue building one on obligation. He did not receive that well." Alice's stomach tightened with worry, both for the rift she had caused between Frederick and his family, and for what it might mean for their future together, given how much of his life remained bound up in that family's approval. "Frederick," she said carefully, "I do not want to be the reason you lose everyone who matters to you." "You are not the reason," he said firmly, cupping her face in his hands so she could not look away from the certainty in his eyes. "The reason is a betrothal that never should have been arranged in the first place, built on land and alliance, rather than any care for either of our happiness. You are simply the reason I finally found the courage to say so aloud. My uncle will come around, in time, or he will not, but I will not measure the worth of my own life by his approval any longer." Alice searched his face for any sign of doubt or regret, and found none, only the same steady certainty that had carried him through the confrontation and back to her door. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now," he said, a smile finally breaking through the exhaustion on his face, "now I would like to introduce you properly to the world, not as a governess traveling alone, and not as a scandal whispered about in drawing rooms, but as the woman I intend to marry, if you will have me, storms and uncertainty and all." Alice's breath caught, and for a moment she could not find any words at all, overwhelmed by how quickly and how completely her careful, certain life had transformed since a wheel broke on a flooded road only a handful of days before. "Yes," she said finally, laughing through sudden tears. "Yes, I will have you, Frederick Lang, storms and uncertainty and all." He kissed her then, in the middle of the inn's common room, with no care at all for who might see, and Alice felt the last of her old fear, the fear that had shaped every careful choice of her life since she was 12 years old, and lost everything to a flooded road much like this one, finally begin to loosen its grip on her heart. The following months were not without difficulty. Frederick's uncle remained cold for a long while, and there were whispers in society that took time to quiet, and Alice faced her own share of doubters who could not understand how a governess had captured the attention of a duke in the space of a single storm. But Frederick stood beside her through all of it, steady and certain in a way that never wavered, and slowly the whispers faded, and even his uncle, seeing how happy his nephew had become, softened by degrees until the coldness thawed into something like acceptance, and eventually something like genuine warmth. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony that Alice insisted on keeping simple, despite Frederick's rank and the grand affair his family might once have expected. And when, on their wedding night, Frederick moved as though from old habit toward a chair near the fire, clearly intending to give her the bed to herself out of some lingering echo of that first storm-bound night, Alice laughed and pulled him back toward her. "No more floors," she said, smiling against his shoulder. "We have earned better than that." He laughed too, low and warm, and held her close, and outside their window, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the sky was clear and calm and entirely free of storms. 5 years passed, and the road to Ashwell had long since been repaired, widened and smoothed until barely a trace remained of the flooded ditch that had once swallowed a coach wheel and changed 2 lives forever. Alice Lang, Duchess of Rannoch, still thought of that road often, especially on nights when rain drummed against the tall windows of the estate she now called home. A home that had grown warmer and fuller with each passing year, in ways she had never dared imagine during her careful, lonely years as a governess with no family left to claim her. Their first child, a daughter with her father's steady gaze and her mother's stubborn chin, had been born 2 years into the marriage, followed a year later by a son who seemed determined from his very first breath to test every ounce of patience his parents possessed. Frederick had proven, to no one's great surprise who had watched him during those 2 storm-bound days, to be a father of remarkable gentleness. The same quiet competence he had shown lighting fires and tending injuries now turned toward soothing night terrors and mending broken toys with equal care. His uncle, Lord Ambrose Kell, had come to visit more and more often as the years passed. His early coldness toward Alice long since melted into a genuine fondness, particularly for his young grandniece, who had somehow discovered that the surest way to soften the old man's stern face was to demand, without fail, that he tell her the story of the storm that had brought her parents together, a story she had heard perhaps 100 times and never once tired of. "Tell it again," she would say, climbing into his lap by the fire, and he would sigh with mock reluctance and begin the tale of a broken wheel, a single room, and a duke foolish enough to spend 2 nights on a hard wooden floor rather than take the only bed for himself. Alice, listening from across the room as she mended a small torn sleeve, would catch Frederick's eye across the firelight, and something would pass between them, unspoken but entirely understood, a private acknowledgement of how far they had traveled since that first frightened night in a stranger's inn. They had returned to that same inn once, several years into their marriage, drawn by an anniversary and a shared, sentimental impulse neither of them had been willing to voice aloud, until they found themselves already on the road toward it. Mrs. Judd had long since passed the running of the inn to her daughter, but the small room under the eaves remained largely unchanged, the same narrow bed, the same sloped ceiling, the same small window that had once framed a storm neither of them would ever forget. They had stood together in that room for a long while, saying little, simply remembering, and when at last Frederick had turned to her, with a familiar, teasing look and asked whether she wanted the bed to herself that night, Alice had laughed so hard she had to sit down on the narrow mattress to catch her breath, and Frederick had laughed with her, and any lingering weight the memory carried had dissolved entirely into warmth. It became a private joke between them from that day forward, a small phrase that meant more than its simple words suggested. Whenever life grew difficult, whenever the weight of the estate or the demands of society pressed too heavily on either of them, one would turn to the other and ask, quietly, "Are you taking the floor tonight?" And the other would answer, always, "No more floors." And somehow the simple exchange was enough to remind them both of everything they had built from a single stormy night neither of them had chosen, and both had come, in time, to be endlessly grateful for. On quiet evenings, long after the children had been put to bed and the great house had settled into stillness, Alice would sometimes find Frederick standing at a window, watching rain fall against the glass with an expression that was no longer wary or troubled, but simply thoughtful, remembering. She would come to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his, and they would watch the storm together, no longer strangers hiding from a world neither of them wanted, but 2 people who had found, in the most unlikely of circumstances, exactly the honest, storm-tested life they had once only dared to hope existed. And every single time, without fail, Frederick would turn to her before the last of the rain cleared, press a kiss to her temple, and murmur the same words he had first spoken all those years ago in a small room under the eaves, words that had carried them through every difficulty since and would carry them, Alice knew with a certainty she had never possessed before that first storm, through every difficulty still to come. "I am glad the wheel broke," he would say, and Alice, every time, would answer the same way she always had. "So am I. God help us both, but so am I."